going to pick up on now on some more general topics and ask for your contributions. Dr. Goodall, I want to start with something you've said in your statement about what things that the civil service could do more to promote candour. So if we could have Dr. Goodall's statement on screen, WITN 7350001, page 12. Oh, I'm sorry, page 3. And it's the bottom of the page, paragraph 5.5. You say this: I think there are two areas in which the civil service, including the Welsh Government, can do more to promote candour. The first is in policy formation and the defence of the government, where we can do more to encourage policymakers and advisers to be more open to advising ministers to acknowledge when a policy has been less successful than it might have been, rather than to always put up the best defence that can be made. And then the second area, paragraph 5.6, you say, whereas the civil service is itself directly providing services, I think there's still an intrinsic reluctance in some parts of the civil service to admit that a mistake has been made and to apologise. So, Dr. Goodall, could I just ask you perhaps just to explain a little more in relation to those 2 points, why it is there is what might be said to be a degree of a culture of defensiveness and potentially a reluctance to apologise, and what could be done in your view to overcome that?
Yeah, I mean, firstly, going to the first point that I shared in my statement, and again, I would reflect a little bit on coming in with a different experience in public services, but from the NHS perspective. When you are running your own organisation and leading your own organisation, I think there is an opportunity more visibly to review the things that work and the things that don't work. Certainly that was true about the ways in which overseeing clinicians used to work, about them needing to reflect on their own practices to support different service changes. Within the civil service context, there is a danger potentially that having started off with a particular intervention, that the role is to allow that intervention to continue despite some of the alternative evidence. And I say that not necessarily in a critical matter, but if I can give the example of myself a number of years ago, just sitting alongside my health minister at the time, talking about a decision that the minister had taken, and on the advice of officials, to stop a particular service and intervention that on its evaluation wasn't working to achieve the outcomes that perhaps we'd intended. So it was a well-intended initiative, but the outcomes, maybe the resources that were associated with, could be better used in a different way. Sort of finding that in the scrutiny that was happening around that approach, that there was actually some criticism of the decision to bring that initiative to an end. And I remember even at that time, the health minister sort of reflecting on that as that feeling quite difficult, in the sense that, of course, there would be, inevitably some examples of a system. We are not going to achieve 100% of successful initiatives in the civil service. It's really important that we are able to bring back that kind of thinking. So I think when I was making my remarks, it was a reflection on some of that experiences. Nevertheless, what I've tried to do in both my Director General role previously, and also as I sort of take forward my permanent secretary responsibilities, is to allow that expectation. And I think that is particularly reinforced by, in my view, an elevation of the importance of data, knowledge, science, evidence, that whilst they are core expectations of the way in which the civil service will deliver its responsibilities, the pandemic experience has actually really brought that to the fore. And I think given a further strength of the way in which actually we are able to sort of balance decisions between different issues, including an ongoing commitment to learn the lessons through what was an extended experience through the pandemic experience. Moving to my second point, and the reluctance, I think there is still a worry that these are issues that do have a reputational damage, but it's really important, drawing on the expectations of the code and of the Nolan principles, to allow civil servants as well as other public servants and bodies to focus on what is right and to ensure that that is shared. And I think I've been trying to ensure that the openness and transparency commitment, is there to be used. We are talking about a no-blame culture, and it's really important to be able to follow through on that, including some of the mechanisms I was describing earlier. But again, I hope that coming in from outside of the civil service through my own roots, where in the NHS that focus on transparency and candour and honesty has been really important. And I have tried to discharge that in my previous NHS chief executive roles, not least when I am handling complaints, individually and with teams where there have been difficult experiences. I would really want to make sure that that becomes more of a culture. As a brief aside, back in 2014, I was involved as the lead NHS chief executive in Wales with what was called the Evans Review, which was an overview of our putting things right arrangements for the NHS in Wales. And that was absolutely also trying to describe this need for that openness and transparency, but the importance of making sure that an apology is given, within those difficult complaints, experiences and responses as well. And I bring that experience, I think, into my new role.
Mr. Chisholm, any observations you have on those matters, and in particular the idea that the civil service, the government may have a natural tendency to try and defend decisions and policies rather than admit that perhaps a different course should have been taken?
Yes, I know that you heard evidence from a number of politicians before, and rightly I think they highlighted our parliamentary system, which is adversarial in a character, and that does encourage people to sometimes defend rather than to admit to error. That was one of the points made by I think William Waldegrave in his evidence. That can also be a feature, obviously, of the media again, which can sometimes be polarised and looking for fault. And indeed, to some extent, the evidence that we have to give in public before things like the Public Accounts Committee obviously focus very much on things that have gone wrong rather than things that have gone right. So those are all things which can add to that. So I think what's important for us is obviously to make sure that we have, as Andrew was just saying there, a real willingness to accept when things have gone wrong, to be very honest with ourselves, to be prepared to not to sort of punish people who come forward, as to say, no retribution for honesty, where people have done their best and acted in good faith, as in the statement before us. I think some of the techniques we've used to try and reinforce that have been obviously learning from others is very good. Learning from other governments, learning from experts. SAGE would be very, very well known in relation to COVID. Other areas, the Industrial Development Advisory Board, etc., like that, all have a role to play. Learning from experience, I think user feedback is incredibly valuable, and one of the ways that we've tried to sort of strengthen that has been for a lot of public services, looking at the sort of data about what the incidence of failures is, how many complaints, how many queries, what's the uptime, what's the throughput rate. In some cases, something called a net promoter score, which we've used from the private sector to try and see whether people would recommend the service to others. That's been very useful. Systematic evaluation of services is very good. So not just choosing to evaluate areas where you know things are okay, but making sure that through an audit program, through evaluation, which we do under the so-called Green Book technique, the What Works networks. These are all ways of making sure that we are constantly looking for things which are not working as well as they could be, and opportunities to improve. The last example I wanted to give, is that if we face public criticism for things which could have been done better, rather than moving into a kind of defensive posture, I think the right response is to quickly recognise, respond and fix that. And as an example, I mentioned in my written statement the work that happened in the Cabinet Office, where we early on in the response to COVID, we had to deal with a lot of procurement issues, and some of those were not 100% correctly done in terms of the record keeping, in terms of some of the process management. And rather than being defensive about that, we got an independent review done by a non-executive director in another department, Nigel Boardman. Those reports, Boardman 1 and 2, were published. We accepted them in their entirety and implemented all of the changes required. And that was done in a matter of months from the original effect. So far from being defensive about it, we quickly used the opportunity to fix and improve.
Ms Fraser, any observations on those issues, the defensiveness and intrinsic reluctance to apologise?
I think that my colleagues from Wales and the UK government have covered the points very well. That intrinsic nature of the political debate can encourage that defensive approach when issues and problems come forward. I think that just as my colleagues have been reflecting, leadership on this is absolutely critical, creating a culture where establishing that the intended consequences are not in fact happening on the ground, and resolving quickly to establish what is happening, and then acting speedily to be able to address it is critical. And it's really creating the conditions where colleagues in the organisation understand that that is what is expected. Government, of course, as in so much in the world, is very complex. Many things are happening simultaneously, and therefore we need the eyes, ears and vigilance and that professional expertise of all of our colleagues, working with stakeholders with those feedback loops to be able to identify when something is going awry, and then to be able to act on it. I do think that the way we endeavoured to work through COVID was a good example of that. Really recognising early on that in line with the National Performance Framework in Scotland, there were 4 harms at play in COVID. Of course, the tragic deaths through COVID, and then an impact on the wider health system, economic and then social harms as well. And therefore that all evidence from all of those areas needed to be brought together, and that we would not get this right all the time from the outset would be virtually impossible to do that, and therefore regular independent reviews absolutely critical. And understanding, for example, that legal considerations, fundamental human rights, really critical in terms of how we should respond and continue to evolve a response. And then ensuring that there's really effective scrutiny through internal audit, through challenge within the organisation, good use of our non-executive directors, our partners in this, and then parliamentary and public scrutiny. And of course, we're very pleased and very active participants in both the UK and Scottish inquiries currently underway on COVID. But all of this absolutely critical for us to be able to learn lessons and to apply those. Thank you.
Ms Brady, any observations from you again on these ideas of defensiveness and the need to admit where things have gone wrong, the importance of admitting where things have gone wrong, and the importance of apologising where an apology is appropriate?
Thank you, and I won't repeat the statements from my colleagues, but just, I guess, to reflect in the RHI inquiry and putting things right in terms of the delivery on those objectives, but also building trust with the citizens we serve. If we can live those values in our code of ethics, and saying apology is a very strong statement in terms of delivering on those aspects and illustrating our integrity, as well as also delivering on the issues to address. Taking a slightly separate angle, I would say from a policy perspective, there's also a propensity sometimes to not stop and to reflect in terms of policy interventions. And I think that's somewhere in the civil service that we have an opportunity to do more of. And I think a positive example would be in terms of the Northern Ireland economic strategy, which I was involved in prior to coming into the role when I was part of the UK's Innovation Expert Group. And it was reflecting on a policy which had delivered outcomes for Northern Ireland economy in terms of FDI, investment, etc., but also reflecting that it hadn't delivered in terms of achieving our productivity goals and indeed our economic inactivity levels, which have been stubbornly at the lowest in terms of the UK across those sectors. So that ability to look internally, to reflect on the areas which haven't delivered outcomes, and then to undertake a review of how those can be achieved and built for the next policy cycle. So part of what the Department for Economy led, and that was a co-development with stakeholders, of which I was in the private sector at that stage, a co-development of those strategies, understanding the data and analysis and the productivity analysis in order to identify those key themes that needed to be delivered on to deliver better outcomes, reflecting that doing more of the same wasn't going to deliver that level of transformation. Part of that also required establishment for an independent board to scrutinise some of our ALBs, led by Sir Michael Lyons, in terms of those objectives, and I guess given that independent analysis to build that into an action plan. And I think the third piece of acknowledgement is that even within those departmental, and I've already spoken about the Northern Ireland constitutional areas of departmental governance models, but also to appreciate that policy level needs to be at a whole system level for many of these complex and cross-cutting and wicked issues. So the need to work with other departments and to find other frameworks, as well as, of course, having the voice of those stakeholders. So also just to reflect where we need to change policy or reflect that the system that we have, of course, it's for ministers to decide, but providing those advice and data-led information to policy decision makers to better inform them for delivering better objectives for the citizens.
One idea, so we can take that down, Lawrence. One idea that has been raised in evidence that the inquiry has heard is the idea of having a statutory duty of candour. And I'm going to invite Dr. Goodall's comment first on this because of his NHS experience. There has for a number of years been a form of a statutory duty of candour on NHS bodies. Dr. Goodall, any views on whether there should be a similar or equivalent statutory duty of candour imposed upon the civil service and government ministers?
Yeah, thanks. Reflecting on the NHS experience, and again, our systems have ended in different places. I think, as you may be aware, the NHS in Wales will formally bring through its statutory duty of candour in April 2023 on the basis of recent legislation. But actually, one of the reasons why we have probably been later in introducing that as a legal requirement was that we did feel that there were inherent options within the system that were reinforced by guidance and different measures, and that included our wish to rely on the putting things right mechanisms in place that were strongly in place there. So as I was describing in my earlier evidence about the Wellbeing and Future Generations Act, on the one hand, it allows a reinforcement in those very strong legal terms about, for example, the duty to collaborate. But actually, the system in Wales is working through the principles of that, whether that is enshrined in the law or not. And the behaviours of systems, I think, often can be supported by not needing to revert to that legal expectation, even if that is ultimately a way of challenging these areas. So having reviewed and argued against that, in the NHS in Wales, over years, because of my leadership role, but ultimately recognising that translation when we took through the healthcare and quality bill for that final area, I sort of understand that there is a need to show that the system is adapting, learning, and of course responding very effectively. The one thing I would reflect on, though, from a civil service perspective is as I said earlier when you were asking me about my Welsh experiences, the strength of the knowledge and the awareness of the code, the way in which it does act as a spine, that it reinforces that complementary relationship between ministers and civil servants, for me, is very strong. So a call for legislation is not really supported by my experience, having been in my permanent secretary role and in my previous roles in Welsh Government over the last 7 to 8 years. I have actually seen how important that has been to both individual teams of civil servants as well as an expectation for the organisation. So I'm not wholly convinced that there is a need ultimately to bring in the legal duty and responsibility, but the evidence of the system failing would obviously be one of the different triggers for that. I would just hope that we're able to continue to give some of the examples in the evidence that we've provided today to show that the civil service can do it irrespective of the law. But I have had that experience, as I said, in the NHS and seen the need to convert it, and where that has provided at least a different framework for that particular sector, and that would translate across to the civil service as a choice.
Mr. Chisholm, should there be a statutory duty of candour imposed upon the civil service and government ministers?
Again, I very much agree with what Andrew was just saying there. I think, first of all, it's important to recognise that the code, the Civil Service Code, is already has a statutory underpinning. The Constitutional Reform and Governance Act 2010 does reinforce the code. And the code, it doesn't exactly say a duty of candour, but it says in as many ways, in a way, even more helpfully, it does say not only acting with integrity, honesty, objectivity and impartiality, but always acting in a way that's professional and deserves and retains the confidence of all those with whom you deal with the public and their affairs fairly, efficiently, promptly, effectively and sensitively to the best of your ability. Set out the facts and relevant issues truthfully and correct any errors as soon as possible. It also says what you mustn't do. You mustn't ignore inconvenient facts or relevant considerations when providing advice or making decisions. You mustn't act in a way that unjustifiably favours or discriminates against particular individuals and interests. So I think that does all of what we want from duty of candour. It does have a statutory underpinning, and I think the bigger area of opportunity is one that Andrew described as saying, look, making sure that leadership and training and practice across the civil service lives up to these standards and everybody fully understands their responsibilities under the code.
Ms Brady, any observations on whether there should be a statutory duty of candour for the Northern Ireland civil service and ministers?
I'm aware that the Northern Ireland NHS is consulting on a statute of candour, but within the broader the civil service, I would concur with my colleagues in that we have, of course, our code of ethics, and those are enshrined in my employment contract, but also those are used as part of our disciplinary process and our commissioners public service commissioners have a right of appeal through that. But this is really living the code of ethics, and every day I use them as a tool for me in my decision making, and I think that's a critical aspect of how we deliver and show to be delivering on those in all our decision making and aspects is as critical as having those enshrined in a legal construct as well.
Ms Fraser.
I would agree with my colleagues that this is about culture, systems and practice and how those work together, and the code is fundamental to the way that civil servants work. Add that as an accountable officer in front of the Scottish Parliament, I take those responsibilities very, very seriously, and I expect to be held personally to account for those and the way that they operate across the Scottish Government. So it feels to me as though that's an area that is well covered. It's about how that system works as effectively as it can do, and I'm not sure that that further legislation would be the area that I would go to. Thanks.
A second area that the inquiry has explored in its evidence has been how a line to take, a departmental or governmental line to take, becomes entrenched, is repeated year after year, administration after administration. I want to ask each of you for any observations you have on why such lines to take become entrenched, and also the role that may be played in that in the time pressures on civil servants, a pressure to get the job done and therefore not enough time potentially to reflect, but rather simply repeating what's been said in the past. Can I perhaps again ask you first of all, Ms Fraser, in relation to those matters?
Yes, I mean, I recognise that can happen, and pressure of time can be a factor. Also, I think just the busyness and the range of issues that government and civil servants are dealing with on any given day, and therefore being able to give proper attention to aspects of new evidence, for example, that's coming forward that suggests your current approach is not doing what it's intended to do. That, I think, the checks and balance in the system there absolutely are about the importance of evaluation and that regular review, about the evidence that comes forward. We work very closely with partners and stakeholders out with government, and as I've been saying earlier, with users and those who experience public services directly. So that evidence loop, in my view, is getting stronger in terms of alerting us to when those issues arise. And that, I think, is the kind of critical area. It's the transparency the openness, the ability for those for whom systems and processes and services are not working to make their views heard. That is absolutely critical, and that link to Parliament and external scrutiny is absolutely vital. Thank you.
Mr Chisholm, any observations on why certain lines to take might become entrenched and the role played by potentially the lack of time that civil or opportunity civil servants may have to reflect on policies?
Well, first of all, I think it's useful to have lines to take because it would be a mistake to try and make it up or to reinvent it each time, bearing in mind that a lot of positions you might be receiving at any point in time thousands of different questions and letters from MPs and indeed from members of the public. So it's a good approach, and also because oftentimes you have to integrate views of different teams, you have to get legal advice, communications advice and so on that. And many times the lines themselves have to be agreed by ministers. So there is a whole kind of process for that. So I think that's good practice rather than bad practice. You're right, of course, to refer to the pressure of work. There is an enormous amount to do, and many times, rather than the lines being entrenched for a long period of time, it's the opposite problem. Lines have to be reinvented over the course of the day in the light of fast developing situations. So I think there's obviously the critical thing is to make sure is that if the facts change, then the lines need to change, and that is we need to make sure there isn't kind of an immobility or a lack of questioning in those lines. But normally speaking, my lived experience is the opposite, that lines are constantly being re-evaluated and changed. So I can see that there's a possibility, and indeed some of the other evidence you've heard from the inquiry suggests that may have been the case in the past in this particular matter, but I don't really see it as a generalised problem.
Ms Brady, any observations on this issue?
Thank you. I would observe as somewhat an external person coming in the prevalence of lines to take, which I think have been very helpful to me in largely in assimilating within the service. However, I think it's the point of that constructive challenge and also the risk-based decision making as well. So I think there's lines to take in some context, but obviously that needs to be reflective of where a process or policy development is underway, and also the risk and implications of perpetuating sufficient lines without proper evaluation. I think a key aspect has been an area we're leading with a new policy development for violence against women and girls, is actually putting the first person experience at the start of that approach. So where we led with a call for views, getting victims' input and public consultation as part of that. So the lines to take are not being perpetuated from previous policies that we had previously, but they're actually being informed by genuinely first-person development. That we did that earlier in the year, and last month we were leading a significant co-design activity again with those stakeholders, those key groups, those co-representatives, so that we're not perpetuating previous kind of perhaps tendencies to have a set view or a set outcome in mind, but actively welcoming and reinforcing the level of challenge and valued input we can get from all those stakeholder groups.
And Dr Goodall.
It is my own experience, having been in Welsh Government over these recent years, I see, as Alex was saying, it being more an active alteration of lines to take that does allow for time and circumstances rather than being seen to be fixed points. I say that because of, as Leslie was describing, the need to ourselves go discharging our accountable officer roles, often on similar topics but at different times, and I don't feel that has been just defending the position as presented in the last discussion. It tends to be a contemporaneous conversation about how we have responded to issues, and also seeing the way in which ministers and the First Minister are supported in their very regular ministerial scrutiny, including when they are asked questions, both in committee and actually in the Welsh Parliament as well. So I see those lines to take very rapidly sort of changing based on circumstances. Having said that, I do think that there is probably something for us from a devolved administration perspective about our sort of size and spread. The significance of the range of responsibilities that we hold can mean that teams are moving from a single issue very rapidly to another set of issues because they may not be quite as a specialist team, for example, as may be located in UK government just because of size reasons. So they can have much more spread responsibilities. And I think probably there may well be some dangers if we're not careful of that being a problem because teams have put their attention elsewhere. Equally, again, as a small administration, if somebody highly expert and involved in something over many years moves on to a different role or indeed retires, I think that might well be a danger because of the reliance will be placed on some of the individuals. And then my final point would be that I think what is important is rather than just leave this to circumstances, the more we can find a way of embedding some evaluation processes that allow these things to be sort of checked and revisited, not just part of day-to-day life, but certainly on some of the higher profile areas. I think those evaluation methodologies, both for how we act as the civil service, but also when we are overseeing the delivery of some of our public service partners, that may be something that could be actually more helpful to call that out and make it explicit.
Now, in relation to mitigating groupthink, we discussed, and you each discussed in your statements, the role for challenge, for gathering diverse views, for hearing contrary opinions, and so on. There's a specific issue I wanted to ask Mr. Chisholm about, and I'm going to put up on screen a Cabinet Office document, CABO 40912. So this is an internal Cabinet Office document, 9th of November 2021, due diligence and impartiality supporting and protecting our networks. And you'll see there, Mr. Chisholm, reference to the Civil Service Code and the requirement for impartiality. And then if we go just to, I think, what's probably the 5th paragraph, where it says it's imperative. It's imperative these core values are at the forefront of everything we do, so that the reputation of the civil service and the relationship between civil servants, ministers and the public's not adversely impacted. This is particularly important when dealing with individuals and external organisations. We recommend that networks conduct research on any individual or external organisation to ensure that they are not engaged in political or campaigning activities. We recognise it's not always clear to determine whether an activity is deemed political or if an individual has spoken against key government policies. This is why all cross-government networks must carry out due diligence checks on all speakers invited to events and the contents of any events and communications to ensure impartiality, and then various checks are then detailed. And then if we go to, I think, page 3, there's an annex to this document. I'm not going to go through it in paragraph by paragraph, but we'll see the bottom of the page, the number of steps set out. Research, so conducting thorough research on the individual or organisation, reviewing corporate publications, media and news articles, social media commentary, and then over the bottom of the page, background keyword search, and then top of the next page, we can see some examples of keywords which range from controversy and criticism of government/Prime Minister to terrorism, anti-Semitism and hate speech. And then key findings. After you've conducted your research, what are your conclusions about this individual or organisations? And then the next paragraph, is there any indication that shows this individual is involved in political commentary and campaigning activity? If yes, do not engage any further. And then if we just go to the next page, please. Annex B, key consideration, sets out a range of questions. And if we just go to the next page, we've then got a template, a due diligence referral template. And if we go to the next page, which should be the final one I need to look at, we pick up the box search engines, refers to carrying out a range of searches to draw out any potentially problematic or controversial material that may contravene civil service values. These searches will vary depending on the topic. Issues to be mindful of include, but are not limited of, criticism of government officials or policy, behaviour or activity that could bring the civil service into disrepute by association, anything that indicates a strong political partiality. Mr. Chisholm, there's a second document, which I think you've also seen, but I don't think we need to look at, which is to similar effect. The reference, for the benefit of those listening, is CABO 40911. Now, it might be said very, very sensible to ensure that people who, for example, have engaged in hate speech are not then engaged to come and provide training or speak to civil servants.
I agree.
But in relation to criticisms of government policy, is it right to understand that the Cabinet Office policy as laid down here is that when we're talking about any form of training or speaker role, those who are critical of government policy or involved in campaigning activities, or those who criticised government ministers, will not be or should not be invited to provide training or to speak to civil servants?
So we have a huge range of people who come to speak to government, and the context in which this guidance was produced was concerns that were expressed about whether or not the value of training was there from the taxpayer perspective, and also whether or not the civil service values in terms of neutrality and impartiality were being lived up to. So in order to make sure that individual staff groups couldn't be susceptible to acting in a political way, perhaps accidentally by inviting people who were known to have party political positions and unintentionally providing a platform for them, that was why we emphasised the need to do appropriate researches. I do want to emphasise very strongly that this is to uphold the civil service values, and if you look at the briefing that went out with this, the other document you mentioned too, it says this is all about making sure we uphold civil service values of integrity, honesty, objectivity. We do not want to restrict personal choice, debate, or diversity of views, but we do make sure that people should do appropriate due diligence before inviting people who unintentionally might bring into question that impartiality. So that's why we introduced that guidance, and I think it was well understood by people in that context.
But would it be right to understand from these documents that the Cabinet Office policy is that those who have voiced criticism of government policy or government decision-making or government ministers should not be invited to provide training to the civil service or to speak to the civil service?
No, there's no ban of any kind like that. And indeed, we have many people from alternative views, some of whom would be very critical of the government, to come and give talks in government, of course. I think the emphasis here was making sure that we should understand people's backgrounds and that we shouldn't invite people without doing appropriate research. So that is the intention behind this particular note you put in front of us.
And going back to the broader theme of trying to mitigate against groupthink, would you accept that it's important that for the civil service to hear from those who may be putting forward an alternative viewpoint, even where, or perhaps particularly where that viewpoint is critical of or contains some challenge to government thinking?
Yes, absolutely essential that we get that alternative view and challenge. And I also, as my colleague from Northern Ireland was saying, it's very important, I think, to hear directly from end users and to ask what their actual experience of the service is. And that too can cause you to think differently about the actual impact of the policy that you're following.
Dr. Goodall, Ms. Fraser, Ms. Brady, are there any, do your respective governments have any similar policies to this in relation to due diligence, looking at whether people have voiced criticism or of government decision-making or government ministers? Ms. Fraser?
Sorry.
I'll start with you then, Dr. Goodall.
It's not set out in a framework in that manner, but of course we would want to ensure that there is some level of appropriateness of people who will be attending to give views. That's not to exclude. I think rather it's to start off with the premise that Alex was describing, which is to ensure that we are able to underpin the code from that perspective. I mean, certainly we have, experiences. First of all, the fact that we're formalising some of our network experiences in Wales by, trying to introduce the concept of one web that formalises the way in which both experiences, secondment exchanges can be made, making sure that the sector voices are very strong in underpinning how government wants to stand forward. I think they put us in good stead to do that. And clearly, if you look at the world of local government in Wales, there will be different sort of political leadership that is involved there that, again, is openly brought around the table to help out with some of these sector experiences as well. So I don't feel that there is an obstacle where, necessarily to do that. I mean, in my own experience, and again, as part of my civil service responsibility, as well as reflecting on many years of dealing with service changes in the NHS, it's really important to make sure that you do have those visible voices. And sometimes the most difficult sessions can be when you are needing to hear and listen to things that perhaps you hadn't expected or didn't want to hear. But nevertheless, they're really important ways of ensuring that you have a genuine understanding of what an experience is, for example, for a citizen living in one of our communities in Wales. So I certainly don't feel that we've had problems about ensuring that there is a breadth of expertise available to us in Wales, but we don't have a similar framework described in that manner.
Ms Fraser.
Yes, we have a similar position to that which Andrew set out for Wales, so not set out in this manner, but our diversity staff networks would have access to advice and support if they were seeking to bring in colleagues from out with the organisation to help with training or awareness raising, and it would cover this sort of territory, just so that those largely volunteer members of the Scottish Government staff who operate our staff networks would have that level of support. Equally, I wouldn't recognise this as being a particular issue in Scottish Government in terms of being a barrier for access to either Scottish ministers or Scottish officials. And indeed, ministers have on occasion sought to create precisely that kind of challenge function. I'm thinking, for example, of the National Advisory Council on Women and Girls, which the First Minister very much supported the establishment of. And that group, from the perspective of women and girls who have not traditionally had access to the levers of power, have a mechanism in association with the Parliament to hold to account both ministers and officials for certainly what works, but more particularly what is not working and what needs particular attention in their view. And I think that that kind of environment and that kind of mechanism can be really important for us hearing uncomfortable truths and getting a good sense of where priority action needs to be focused. Thanks.
Ms Brady.
Yes, we also don't have any such due diligence framework in terms of evaluation, and also reflected earlier, we were a 5-party coalition, so within our executive we would have a differing range and often quite a polar difference of views. In addition to our assemblies who have representatives from all parties, there has been indications for the next executive there will be an official opposition. Also as part of it, they would be regularly providing the challenge functions through those scrutiny sessions within our assembly. We also have advocates such as the Children's Commissioner, the Older Persons Commissioner, the Victims Commissioner, who we would regularly have advising us in terms of those difficult truths and the implications from that person-centred approach. In reflection of Northern Ireland, we would say that it is best to have those direct challenges and to provide policy development and progress in terms of allowing those kind of conflicting views, which has been so important for us in terms of bringing us to where we are at the moment.
Thank you. We can take that down. The last topic I wanted to ask you all about is about the ability of the civil service and government to learn from mistakes and abilities for reflective learning. Just to put the question in context, I think it's fairly well recognised that there have been a number of inquiries, public and otherwise, in relation to NHS decision-making over the last few years, particularly, but not limited to, in England, where similar concerns and issues and topics get raised in an inquiry report, and then 2, 3, 4 years later, there's another public inquiry report looking at the functioning of the NHS in which the same problems are articulated again, which might suggest that learning from mistakes is something of which there still needs to be a lot of work done. In relation to government, civil service and government, what systems or processes are there within the civil service to try and learn from past errors, whether they're errors identified in public inquiry reports or otherwise? I'll pose that question first of all, I think perhaps to Ms Brady most topically, because you have been involved in the response to the RHI report.
Thank you. Well, in terms of the RHI report, of course, there was a public inquiry which provided really very helpful feedback and analysis in terms of the areas that we needed to address and the key themes, which were, as you mentioned, across different areas: professional skills, ministers and advisors, resourcing and people, collaborating, communicating, governance, record keeping and raising the concerns. So very multifaceted across the entirety of the civil service system. From that, we identified a number of actions that were required to be delivered, 45 recommendations, which were formally responded to by the Department of Finance, who has responsibility as an accounting responsibility for delivering those, on which we are held to account within our Assembly scrutiny sessions and delivery sessions. They are also formed of part of an MOU between the Department of Finance and between the First Minister and Deputy First Minister in the Executive Office. So we have a joint commitment in terms of delivering those through that, the need to have a joined up approach and service, understanding that although one department has a policy responsibility of this is about a system-wide change across the service. We also responded via a memorandum of reply in terms of our audit office's response to those inquiries and are delivering an action plan as part of those. Those will form the underpinning work for renewal of our civil service. I talked earlier about the Northern Ireland Civil Service Board. Our corporate programme will be delivering those outcomes in terms of the RHI. There will be findings, I am sure, from us to take in learnings and reflections as part of the COVID public inquiry. There are other external reviews which are being undertaken at the moment. So those will form the core aspects and delivery items. But these are more, and I talked as well about some new policies and some new legislation which come into place as part of this. This needs to be led at a system level, at a culture level, across all of the departments. So it is critical that we have the specific focus within that civil service board, and also to have that additional scrutiny and be held account both by our non-execs and also by the executive in terms of those delivery aspects. So whilst there is action plans and accountability and dates and frameworks and resources set beside that, it also needs to be delivered at that cultural level, and it needs to have a governance and a delivery vehicle, which is our Civil Service Board.
Dr Goodall, any observations on from the Welsh perspective on learning from mistakes and the capacity of the Welsh Civil Service for reflective learning?
Well, first of all, to state the leadership expectation, but the learning organisation should be expected and supported. There's no excuses based on how busy our environment is or the range of areas that we're dealing with. We need to be able to demonstrate that that is something that must happen in practice. There is a danger, again, looking at it through my health lens and experience, of leaving an individual service issue just with that own service rather than allowing the broader learning in any organisation. And I think one of our challenges is to make sure that we spread that learning more broadly. So I was used, for example, in the NHS Wales experience, to be able to take a review that had been done, for example, of the English health system, like the Mid Staffordshire review, and then be able to use that as a trigger and expectation for how we would be responding, putting in different measures and looking for assurance across Wales in itself, even though that had come through a different system. And also in my experience in Welsh Government, and this would be in my Director General role, where we have highlighted concerns in areas such as mental health or in maternity in an individual health board, to ensure, again, as an output from those local concerns, that we have translated that to a national assurance approach that means that all of the different health boards as well. So as we discharge our oversight role for these public services in Wales, I think we can bring to the fore some of those experiences as well. I think we need to use the challenge mechanisms that are available within the civil service and within Welsh Government, and we've highlighted some of those during today's session. the use of internal audit, the use of external reviews, those such as done by our commissioners or by Audit Wales, using our non-executive directors. These are all ways ensuring that those lessons are reviewed and learned. And I do think that there is a genuine significance for the way in which the civil service itself will have gone through all of the difficulties of responding to the pandemic expectations, because we ourselves have learnt many things about the way in which we have operated and responded in a different way because of the extraordinary circumstances. And I know from my own personal experience in Welsh Government that beyond the health response, we have sat and reviewed and produced lessons learned and looked at different areas and ensured that we have not just left them static in time, but actually progressed them and made sure that we've put in other interventions as well. And just to finish, one of the things that I've been asking for from the organisation as we've been talking about our own change programme and our focus on values is really to ensure that we ourselves have learned lessons from the pandemic experience about the way in which the civil service in Welsh Government is going to work and operate into the future as well. So I think there is a strong basis to show that our environment is absolutely picking up on supporting that concept of a learning organisation.
Mr Chisholm.
Yeah, just a couple of comments to add to what colleagues have said. Obviously, rightly they emphasise the role of the internal culture of challenge and willingness to learn, the role of external review bodies and inquiries indeed there. Other things to add would be what I would call a kind of a culture of continuous improvement in service delivery, where you want to fix something fast in the light of evidence about coming from queries and complaints coming in every day. That shouldn't require a big a kind of major review type process. It should be something that you fix in near real time. Secondly, when we look to try and embed lessons learned, the way we do that is through policies, through handbooks, through playbooks, as they're sometimes called that, and those apply. For example, if you're looking about the experience we have in dealing with people, HR policies would embed a lot of the lessons we've learned from that. The same would apply across finance, across procurement, across security. All the different areas of professional and functional expertise are very much codifying the lessons we've learned there. That makes it much easier, obviously, for people to come into those roles to be able to say, well, what's the look-up guide to how to behave in this situation? And it's set out in those policies and handbooks. We then reinforce that through our assurance processes, so that oftentimes when, for example, if you're getting involved in procurement, you're meant to follow the guidance on procurement. There's a kind of comply or explain type approach, and if you want to deviate from that, that has to be justified. And those are, again, public notices, public procurement notices, PPNs, it's all set out there. The same would be true for a lot of managing public money type things. And indeed, in our interactions with Parliament, you're probably aware that when we appear before the Parliamentary Accounts Committee, that's on the foot of a report from the NAO. And after the evidence session, the Public Accounts Committee then publishes a report of saying what's expected to do, and a lot of those are lessons learned and improvements we need to make. The government has to formally respond to that for a Treasury Minute exercise, saying this is whether we accept or occasionally don't accept the recommendation, and then in the many cases where we do accept it, by when will it be acted on and what is the evidence of that, and we have to update the committee very systematically from that. So I think that's a good process, a sort of a mechanism for continuous improvement. Other two features to mention, not yet mentioned, are external comparisons. So benchmarking is very powerful from this perspective. Andrew was speaking there about COVID. Obviously, in COVID, as well as the opportunity to compare within the UK to different stances, we had great opportunities to compare the responses of over 100 different nations, and we very systematically did so, and on a very constant basis throughout the peak of the response, in order to see what we can learn from other administrations. And finally, I think it's very important to have this evaluation at the end of major programmes. That's something that's already required by government guidance, but to give it an additional spur, we set up a year and a half ago now the evaluation task force, and they've now advised on the evaluation of 169 different programmes worth over £80 billion. So it's a very big part of making sure that we make sure that we are properly reflective, we do learn, and then we, importantly, don't just gather the lessons, but that we implement them, and we can do that in a way which is very clearly demonstrable.
Ms Fraser.
My colleagues have covered that topic, I think, extremely well. I think the point where Alex was just finishing on the importance of transparency in all of this is really critical. The Scottish Government had a number of views to respond to in relation to the way in which we handled complaints against the former First Minister from 2 lawyers and from the Parliamentary Committee, all with incredibly helpful and useful advice for us. And what's been very important for us in terms of taking that work forward has been absolutely to put all of those different elements of training and systems change and business practice change and internal and external challenge and scrutiny, but also to be able to report, in this instance, to a committee of the Scottish Parliament on the measures of success which we have developed, for example, in this instance with trades union colleagues and with other external partners, as well as with input from our own staff, and so that we can be as clear and again can be held to account formally in terms of the actions that we're taking and the impact that that's having. And I think the role of transparency in this is very helpful for us as an organisation, learning these lessons and being and demonstrating both to Parliament and to others externally how precisely we're going about that. Thank you.
Thank you. So those are the issues I was proposing to explore. We obviously need to have a short break to see whether there are any further questions from core participants.
Yes, well, we'll take an unusually short break because I know that Mr. Chisholm is particularly concerned not to be delayed due to his commitments. So we'll take a break for 10 minutes, shall we?
Yes, hopefully that'll be sufficient.
And say not before 1:45, and not before, just in case more time is needed.
Thank you, sir.